We'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which this podcast was produced, the Gadigal People of the Eora Nation. We pay our respects to elders past and present.
It's 2015 and we're in London with journalist Johann Hari. He's about to take to the stage, and for the next 20 minutes, he'll explain that everything you know about addiction is wrong. He should know. He spent the last 3 years conducting research around the world trying to answer the core questions on addiction. This topic is one close to his heart. One of his earliest memories is trying to wake up a family member and not being able to. A room full of people watching his TED Talk will hang on to his every word. And they aren't the only ones. This TED Talk, along with another 4 years later, will go on to be viewed more than 90 million times. I'm Matt Middleton, and this is Head Game. Today, Johann Hari on making an impact by investigating life's biggest issues. Thank you ever so much for coming on my podcast, Head Game. Fascinated with getting into an in-depth conversation. You've just got a nose for knowing what you want. It's almost that you have an addiction for a certain subject, knowing what you want and then going after it tenfold and getting the best out of not only yourself but out of other people and out of a situation. So talk to me about your upbringing.
I come from a fucking weird background. So my parents met here in London. They were both runaways. My dad had run away from the Swiss mountains. He grew up in a tiny little wooden hut on the side of a mountain where, like, from the age of 5, you'd be working with the pigs, you'd be working in the fields. And when he was 17, he's like, there's got to be more to life than this. And he heard there was, like, something going on. It was the 60s in London. So he ran away, came here. And my mum was a runaway. She grew up in a very poor working class family in Scotland, you know, where life for women was not that good. And with her best friend Mary, she ran away and they met in a nightclub just off Carnaby Street when my dad spoke literally 10 words of English and my mum only spoke English. And they had what my mum calls a series of one-night stands, which I've tried to explain is not a concept that makes sense. If there's more than one of them, it's not a one-night stand. You know, the family I grew up in, there was a lot of, without going into too much detail because it's their story, other people's story, not just mine, but it's a lot of addiction, a lot of madness, really. I was mostly raised by my grandmother, my Scottish grandmother. And it was weird because they were, they came, everyone in my family left school when they were like, my gran left when she was 13, most of them when they were 15. And it's really weird if you watch our home videos, even when I'm a little kid, I have this weird posh voice. I'm like Stewie from Family Guy, right? So like my mum's like, what do you fucking want, son? And I'm like, really, mother? I find this most inappropriate.
I can see that, mate.
It's just bizarre. And I don't know why, because Edgware where I grew up, no one had this weird posh voice that I have. I must have got it off the TV because I can't think, no one spoke like that. So it was this weird, even when I was very young, I had this slight kind of, I had a great love for the place I was from and the people I grew up with, but I also had this weird kind of doubleness about it.
Mm-hmm. I can see that in you. Where did you think that come? Because it certainly didn't come from your mum. It didn't come. Where do you think that came from?
I genuinely don't know. It's a really strange thing. I don't know. It was, I think, because they were not from the place we were from, right? And they felt very alienated from the place they're from. They didn't really understand. My dad's English was, imperfect. Like,
broken.
I could sort of navigate that world better than they could in a way, right? So I was sort of translating for them. And my mum was from a very, working class Scottish background.
Yeah, you were probably between the two, sort of merging the two together, right?
Translating for them, but also figuring out how this place worked, right? So I didn't have this... they didn't. In a way, as a kid, I understood it better than they did.
And you were trying to figure it out for them as well.
Yeah.
Whilst figuring out your journey.
And I think one of the reasons, I think really the only talent I have, that's not being falsely self-deprecating, it's a real talent, but it's the only one I've got, is communication, right? I'm good at communication. I think it's partly because of that early experience of, oh, right, they don't know how this works, right? I've got to figure out how this works. And also that thing, if you grow up in chaotic environments, lots of people who grow up in chaotic or violent or environments where there's addiction or mental health problems or whatever. Just this really amazing statistic. I can't remember the exact figure. People can look it up. But something like 60% of the presidents and prime ministers, US presidents and British prime ministers of the 20th century grew up in a family where one of their parents either died, became disabled, or became bankrupt when they were a kid. And there's a big debate about why that might be, right? It's an incredibly high figure compared to the general population, right? And I think, and it's truly incredible, you just do the prime ministers backwards, you can do it, right? And the presidents. And I think that must be something about, if you grow up in a chaotic environment, you've got to be the grown-up, you've got to be the adult very quickly, right?
Yeah.
And it's a thing about, you want to make it all okay.
Yeah.
You know, you want to solve the problems.
Yeah, or make sense of it, I suppose, as well, isn't it? You know, try and make sense of it so it's not as chaotic. And I suppose it just takes a different way of thinking, different way of problem solving, different way of tackling a situation that your parents or the people around you don't use, but you sort of adapt as you go along.
Well, you've got to be the problem solver from a very young age, and that becomes your skill set. Not everyone. Some people it just breaks them and fucks them up, but a lot of people, I think it means that you become the person who then is thinking about, okay, from a very young age, you're like, okay, no one's going to come and solve this for me. I've got to solve this situation. And I think that becomes a habit you can take over into other things, right? Okay, there's this other chaotic thing going on in the world. I'm not going to wait for someone else to solve it. What's going on here? Let's figure out what's going on. Let's figure out how we can sort it out. So I think that was very deep in me. That, you know, that thing the Persian poet Rumi said, the wound is where the light enters you. It's something I think about all the time, right? I'm sure it was somewhere in Leonard Cohen's heart when he wrote his famous line about there's a crack in everything. It's how the light gets in, right? I think it's a thing about if you have a very extreme childhood or extreme experiences in general, you can see that as a curse and it can just fuck you, right? And of course that does happen to many people. It does have terrible effects on them. Or you can say, okay, this is not good. It's not good this happened. I wish it hadn't. But given that, what strengths can I take from this? What have I learned from this experience that can be used to help other people or to go forward? So I think it's always, you know, we talk a lot about post-traumatic stress, right? Which is of course a real thing. But there's also a lot of scientific evidence for something called post-traumatic growth, right?
Absolutely.
Some people go through, like, for example, you can look at survivors of plane crashes, for example, right? Now, no one is ever glad they've been in a plane crash, just to be clear.
Yeah.
But some people go, I was in a plane crash, it fucked me up, it was the worst thing that ever happened, I've been traumatized ever since. But a lot of people who've been in plane crashes say, you know, it was a terrible thing that I was in that plane crash. But after I survived, I quit that job I hated and I left the husband who was treating me like shit. And actually, it was the best thing that ever happened to me.
Going back to your childhood, it was addiction that really sort of highlighted one of your first memories when you tried to wake up a family member from, I don't know if it's an overdose. Can you just take me back to that moment? Because, you know, it's fascinating how you talk about this, but you've actually been through it yourself.
I don't remember the exact age I was. I've tried to figure it out with my sister, but so one of my relatives was using mostly prescription drugs and was just out of it a lot of the time. So I have these kind of formative memories of trying to wake up this relative and just not being able to because they were just out of it.
Just on the bed or on the couch?
Yeah. And both. And one of the reasons I spent so much time researching addiction for a book I wrote called Chasing the Scream was because these addiction problems continued in my family, actually more than one member of my family. And also I think like with a lot of people who grow up with addiction, it was a thing that was very, if that feels like home to you, I ended up being in a relationship with someone who had a very bad crack and heroin addiction. Actually slightly weird, we're in Shoreditch. And this was where I lived at the time. And it's a place I really associate with that relationship. So I could tell you the map of all the dealers he went to in a mile radius of here. But I think that one of the reasons I wrote the book is every book I ever write, for me, is because there's got to be, I'm not an expert on anything, right? I'm a journalist. For me, it's got to be that there's a mystery that I don't understand and I want to understand, right? So I then go on this kind of journey all over the world.
Would you say you get addicted to a topic? When can we talk about addiction? Because there's multiple forms of addiction, right? And we talk about the obvious ones, which are alcohol, drugs, prescription drugs. But for you, and having read your backstory and meeting you, do you think addiction sort of runs in the family? Is it something that is passed down from generation to generation, or do you just have an acute sort of curiosity? You need to know everything about that topic. Is that an addiction?
It's interesting you say that, because actually the research I did for Chasing the Scream completely changed how I understood what addiction is. I wanted to figure this out because I could see nothing I was doing was helping, right? With these people that I loved, I couldn't solve the problem. And I also had that, if I'm honest, I was quite angry with them, right? And everyone who's ever loved someone who's got an addiction problem has got a voice in their head that's like, why don't you just fucking stop?
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Fuck's sake.
Yeah.
Pull yourself together, right?
That's the natural. Yeah. That's the natural sort of thought process to have. Well,
I think it's part of the natural.
You're ruining yourself. You're ruining the people around you. You're waste of space. It's.
I could see that. I think almost everyone has two natural impulses.
Yeah.
They have that voice.
Yeah.
And they have the voice like, I can see you're really suffering and in pain.
Yeah.
And that this is not just, you're not just partying hard and indulging yourself. There's something really deep going on here that you need help for. So I think almost everyone has those two things, right? But I wanted to understand what was really going on here. So it ended up being this kind of insane journey all over the world, like 30,000 miles. I ended up meeting a crazy mixture of people from and getting to know, obviously I write about in the book, from a trans crack dealer in Brooklyn, who's one of the smartest people I know, to a hitman for the deadliest Mexican drug cartel, who actually is not one of the smartest people I know, to the only country that's decriminalized all drugs with incredible effects that we can talk about. But that actually, in relation to your question, it was the strangest thing, because I realised, I learned so much writing Chasing the Scream, but one of the things I learned is that I had profoundly misunderstood what I had seen in front of me for so long. So let's say heroin addiction, for example, right? Because that's something that was close to me. So if you'd asked me 13 years ago when I started doing the research on this, Johann, what causes heroin addiction? I would have looked at you like you were a muppet, and I would have said, well, mate, the clue's in the name, man, right? Yeah. Obviously, heroin causes heroin addiction. Exactly. We've been told this story for 100 years that's become totally part of our common sense about addiction, right? When I was in this story about the earliest story about addiction that we've all been told, which has some truth in it, right? So we think, we're sitting here in Shoreditch, if we kidnap the next 20 people to walk past this recording studio,
I can make that happen.
Let's do it. Yeah, you are one of the few people I know who could actually do it, right? And we held them all hostage in this weird fucking little room, like a villain in a Saw movie. And we injected them all with heroin 3 times a day for a month.
Yeah.
At the end of that month, they'd all be heroin addicts. For a simple reason, there's chemical hooks in heroin. And if you're exposed to them for long enough, your body would start to desperately crave these chemical hooks, right? That's why in English, another word for being addicted is being hooked, right? It turns out that is a very small part of what's going on in addiction, right? It's some role, but it's very small. And the first thing that alerted me to the fact there's something missing in that story is when it was explained to me by lots of doctors. If you or me, if we stepped out of this studio now and we got hit by a truck and you broke your hip or I broke my hip, we'd be taken to the Royal London Hospital up the road, and they give us a lot of a drug called diamorphine. Diamorphine
is heroin.
It's much better than the shit my ex used to score around the corner. Exactly. It's medically pure heroin. It's the best heroin you can get, right?
Yeah.
If anyone listening, if you've got a grandmother who's ever had a hip replacement operation, your nan's taken lots of heroin, right?
Yeah.
Now, if what we think about addiction is right, that it's caused primarily or entirely by exposure to the chemical hooks, what should be happening to all these grandmothers having hip replacement operations?
Addicted.
They should be leaving and trying to score on the streets, right? This has been studied very carefully. It never happens with hip replacements, right? Never, right? And you hear that and you think, what? I remember when I first learned this from a brilliant doctor called Gabor Mate, just saying, well, Gabor, that can't be right. How could you have a situation where you've got someone in a hospital bed, they're being given loads of medically pure, strong heroin, They don't become addicted.
Yeah, the best grade of it, really, if you put it in layman's terms.
Exactly, the best shit. And you've got someone in the alleyway outside,
Yeah.
shooting up actually a weaker form of the drug, and they do
Yeah.
become addicted to what's going on. And I only began to understand it when I went to Vancouver and interviewed an incredible man named Professor Bruce Alexander, who did an experiment that has really transformed how we understand addiction all over the world. So he explained to me this story we've got in our heads that addiction is caused primarily or entirely by the chemical hooks comes from a series of experiments that were done earlier in the 20th century. You take a rat, you put it in a cage and you give it 2 water bottles. One is just water, the other is water laced with either heroin or cocaine. If you do that, the rat will try both, almost always prefers the drugged water, and it almost always kills itself by overdosing pretty quickly, right? So there you go, that's our story. The rat tries the drug, it needs more and more of the chemical
That's
hooks.
all it has to do.
It dies, right?
That's
That's our story. But in the 70s, Professor Alexander, was working with people with addiction problems in Vancouver. He looks at these experiments and he said, well, hang on a minute. You put the rat alone in an empty cage. It's got nothing that makes life worth living for rats. All it's got is the drugs. What would happen if we did this differently? So he built a cage called Rat Park, which is basically like fucking heaven for rats, right? They've got loads of friends. They've got loads of cheese. They've got loads of coloured balls. Anything a rat likes is there in Rat Park. It's got its needs met, right? Psychological needs. And then he gives them both the water bottles, the normal water and the drug water. And of course they try both. This is the fascinating thing.
Now the rat's going to have fun.
Well, in Rat Park, they don't like the drug water that much, right? They don't use it compulsively. None of them use it compulsively. None of them die by overdose,
Because they've got shit to do, right?
Because they've got, the way I would think about it is, everyone knows you've got physical needs.
Yeah.
You need food, you need water, you need shelter, you need clean air. If I took those things away from you, you'd be fucked. But there's equally strong evidence that all human beings have natural psychological needs. You need to feel you belong. You need to feel your life has meaning and purpose. You need to feel people see you and value you. You need to feel you're loved. You need to feel you've got a future you understand, right? And this culture we built is good at many things. I'm glad to be alive today. But we have been getting less and less good at meeting these deep underlying psychological needs. So the reason I wouldn't put it as, because you asked it totally understandably, and it's the way I used to think about it, is, oh, can you override the chemical thing? I would put it differently. The core of addiction is about not wanting to be present in your life because your life is too painful a place to be. Exactly, right? And when you understand that, you begin to see, firstly, for me, the first thing you see is how what we do.
It's a value. You start to value yourself, start to value things around you, and you know your product. And again, that excuse the cliche. I'm sure you hate it, but you're a product of your environment.
Exactly.
Right?
It's not you, it's your cage, right? Now, there's other factors going on as well. It's not the only, Rat Park doesn't explain everything about drug use. Obviously, there's lots of other things going on, but it explains a really big missing part of the picture. And it can lead you to quite painful and difficult realizations. I mean, the most important thing, though, and the really powerful realization is what it made me realize. I'll never forget when I interviewed Bruce the first time, and I went and sat in we were in this area called the downtown east side of Vancouver, which has a lot of chaotic street addiction. And I went and sat in a pigeon park, which is a park with loads of pigeons in it, and where people are, it's pretty free-for-all, chaotic drug scene. And I remember thinking, oh, right, so the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. That's what he's saying, right? And sure, I'll never forget that moment because now, like, people put that on T-shirts and things since I wrote about it, which is really, and did a TED Talk on it. But the core of it is, and it's why when you asked, is this an addiction for me? I don't think of it as, it may have elements of addiction because I do overwork, but for me, this is not a way of not being present in my life. This is actually a way of being more present in my life. So it's a healthy obsession rather than an addiction is how I would think of it, right? Mm-hmm. If it would be an addiction if it was actually I was avoiding being present by doing this stuff, right?
But you're actually like super present at what you do, so yeah, it's a healthy addiction.
There are moments like that. I massively overwork. I tend to get burned out because I'm very bad at taking breaks or pacing myself. So I wouldn't want to totally rule out the kind of implicit thought in your question, but when you understand addiction in this different way, you understand firstly why that natural angry, why are you fucking doing this, doesn't get us very far, right? But also, for me, the most important thing about it is you realise how what we do as a society, why it has so catastrophically failed when it comes to addiction. The US at the moment, for example, has the biggest addiction crisis in its entire history, right? Horrendous. And obviously I live half the year in the US. Because what we do is we think about addiction totally differently. The theory of the war on drugs, right, is people who are addicted need to have pain inflicted on them to give them an incentive to stop, right? So we make them suffer, give them criminal records, we imprison them. But then you realise...
We limit them, we pigeonhole them.
Exactly. And fuck them over, right?
Yeah.
And then you realise, but once you understand that pain is the fuel, is the driver, is the cause of addiction, suddenly you realise, sometimes we go, it doesn't work, it's not, that model doesn't work. The answer is much worse. It makes the problem worse, right? And never forget, I had a moment about this. I went to lots of places for the book, obviously, for the killing fields in northern Mexico, and all sorts of places. But I think the place that most haunts me was there's this place called Tent City in Phoenix, in Arizona, in Maricopa County in Arizona. So it was at the time run by a guy called Sheriff Joe Arpaio, who I mean, we can have a whole conversation about childhood trauma and Joe Arpaio, but he's a fucked up guy who was really at war with people with addiction problems. And he opened this prison where, bear in mind, this is the desert, this is Arizona. People were made to sleep in tents in the desert, and they were deliberately, maximally humiliated. You might have heard this because Mike Tyson was sent there. I've talked to Mike about it. They make the people with addiction problems go out on chain gangs, wearing T-shirts saying, I was a drug addict, while members of the public mock them. So I went out one day with this group of women. You only had to speak to these women for 5 minutes. Their lives had been fucking horrendous, right? And they'd all been fucking abused in one way or another. And so we go out, and they were made to, literally on a chain gang, and they're made to collect litter while members of the public mock them, right? And
what was that in order to hopefully make them realise the errors of their ways through that type of treatment? So they go, oh, that's me cured. I'm good. I won't do that again.
Exactly.
But ultimately, what you're doing is you're getting a sledgehammer and you're just driving them further into the ground, right? I
think you put it perfectly. So they had a block, an isolation block in this prison, which people were put in for the tiniest infringements, like having a cigarette. And I went and I said to them, and it was a weird thing, most prisons, obviously I visited a lot of prisons as a journalist, most prisons don't want to show you their bad stuff. They try to steer you away from it. But this prison, because the whole point of it is to humiliate people, it's like a pantomime of fucking sadism. They actually want to show it to you. So I said, will you show me the isolation block? Thinking they go, no, that's, like most prisons would. Oh, sure, come along.
Yeah.
So go along. And the first thing that happens, so the women are in tiny little bare stone cells in the middle of the desert. It's unbelievably hot. They're completely on their own. They've got nothing in this cell. Literally, you're in a stone. It's about the size of this room we're in. We're in a tiny little podcast studio, right? And so they open the little flap, and a woman starts immediately screaming at me, showing me that she's been cutting herself, just screaming and screaming. It's one of the worst things I've ever seen, right? And I looked at this woman and I thought, this is the closest you could get to a literal human replica of the cages that guaranteed addiction in rats. And this is what you're doing to this poor fucking woman, thinking it'll stop her being addicted. Now, okay, that's very extreme, right? Okay, that's the hardest edge, the tip of the spear. But actually, 80% of the money we spend, in some countries actually it's more, but 80% of the money we spend on drug policy is enforcement, punishing people, shaming people, fucking them up more, right? The other 20%, by the way, about 10% is treatment, and 10% is the ridiculous fucking fantasy we can keep drugs out of the country. If you want to think about how well that's going to work, we can't even keep drugs out of our prisons where we pay people to walk around the fucking wall the whole time.
Exactly.
So good luck with keeping them out of the United States with 2,000-3,000 mile borders, or Britain, which is an island, right?
100%.
A ridiculous, insane fantasy.
But this is like the human rat cage that you talk about, right? This is the human form of the rat cage where all they have to do is shoot up drugs. So the addiction gets worse and worse and worse because of their environment and where they're around. They've got no one. If anything, people are belittling them, punishing them, fucking limiting them, telling them that they're fucking no good, that they're a waste of space, that they belong down there. You're almost amplifying that problem tenfold, right?
Exactly. And the reason that is so fucking enraging It's because some people hear that and go, isn't it sad? Isn't it bad? Yeah, I get it. But the thing that is so fucking enraging about that is I went to places where they tried completely different approaches that actually do reduce addiction, and where all these people I knew in that tunnel, or the vast majority of them, would have lived and had decent lives and not fucking died, right? So to give an example of Portugal. So the year 2000, Portugal had one of the worst drug problems in the whole world. 1% of the population was addicted to heroin, which is kind of mind-blowing, right, when you think about it.
Insane.
And every year they tried the American way more, they arrested more people, they imprisoned more people, they shamed more people. And every year the problem got worse. Until finally the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition got together and they were like, look, we can't go on like this with ever more people dying and getting addicted. What are we going to do? So they decided to do something really radical, something no one had done in nearly 100 years since the war on drugs globally began. They were like, should we ask some scientists what to do? So they set up a panel of scientists and doctors led by an amazing man.
Common sense.
Exactly. It's this amazing guy I became friends with called Dr. João Goulão. And they said to them, you guys go away, figure out what would genuinely solve this fucking massive crisis. And we've agreed in advance, we'll do whatever you recommend, right? So the goal was to just take it out of politics. So the panel went away, they looked at all the evidence, including Rat Park. And they came back and they said, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to decriminalise all drugs, from cannabis to crack, the whole fucking lot. But they probably didn't say fucking because they're not as potty mouthed as me, but we're going to decriminalise the whole lot. But, and this is the crucial next step, we're going to take all the money we currently spend on screwing people up, on shaming them, imprisoning them, and we're going to spend all that money instead on turning their lives around. And what's interesting was when they did it, a lot of it was not what we think of as drug treatment in Britain, right? So they did a lot of rehab, right? They did do that. But the main stuff they spent money on was housing, because you're not going to fucking sober up when you're living in a tunnel or under a bridge.
Underground, yeah.
And the biggest thing was a big program of job creation. So say you used to be a mechanic, you've got a smack addiction, they'll go to a garage, they'll say, if you employ this guy for a year, we'll pay half his wages. So it was a huge program of reconnection, getting people reconnected to the society. Yeah,
because you're a junkie, you've got a criminal record, you're not getting a job, you're not trusted, you're looked at as the scum of society.
Exactly.
Right?
And instead of that, they wanted to take all that messaging and go, actually, we love you, we value you.
Here's a job.
We're on your side. We want you back, right? And by the time I went to Portugal, it was...
And when was this
They started the decriminalisation in 2001. And when I went there, it was, for the first time, it was 2012 I must have gone there, or maybe 2011, I think 2012. And the results were in. Best research on it is in the British Journal of Criminology. They had a massive fall in addiction. They went from having the highest level of overdoses in the European Union to almost the lowest. They had a massive fall in street crime, massive fall in street prostitution, massive fall in HIV transmission. And one of the ways you know it worked is that no one in Portugal wants to go back. I went and interviewed one of the leading opponents of the drug decriminalisation at the time, a guy called João Figueira. He was the top drug cop in the country when they did it. And he said, totally understandably, he said, this is fucking madness, right? We can't decriminalise all drugs. We'll have an explosion in drug use. We'll have an explosion in kids using drugs. We'll have an explosion in drug tourism. This is a nightmare. And when I met João, he said to me, everything I said would happen didn't happen, and everything the other side said would happen did. And he said he felt really ashamed now when he looked back on it that he'd spent 20 years making people's lives worse when they could have been helping people turn it around. Now, drug decriminalisation hasn't worked everywhere, partly because it hasn't been done on the Portuguese model, because the Portuguese model was stop punishing people. That's the first step. It's the equivalent of stopping kicking them in the head. But then crucially, take all the money we spent screwing them up and spend it helping them, right?
Get them out of their box.
Exactly. So the core of it actually is the social change, right? The reconnection, the getting people back to a decent life.
Stigma, changing that stigma.
Exactly.
Right?
And also people, especially when you undo the stigma, people are more likely to come forward for help, right? It's interesting, in Portugal, it's one thing that's fascinating me, going out with some of the social workers. In Vegas, if you go out with the authorities, people with addiction problems fucking run away from you, right? In Portugal, they run towards you. It changes the whole dynamic.
Yeah, wow. So again, talking on either side, it's that drastic change of flipping it on its head.
And this is true for loads of the topics that I write about where, my book's Chasing the Scream is about addiction, obviously, and the war on drugs. Actually, there are even worse things about the war on drugs, like the violence it causes, which we can talk about as well. That's why I spent a lot of time with dealers and cartels. But, my second book, Lost Connections, was about why so many people are depressed and anxious. My third book, Stolen Focus, was about why so many people are struggling to pay attention. My most recent book, Magic Pill, is about these new weight loss drugs, what they're going to mean for all of us.
Ozempic.
But with all of them, I think there's a thing about reframing what the problem is really about. If you're stuck in a mindset where you just think, I'm a fuck up, there's something wrong with me, and there's definitely individual responsibility, and I'm in favour of individual responsibility,
of course,
passionately. But if you're stuck in a model where you just think, oh, I'm a fuck up, and it's like if you're the rat in the isolated cage, but you're not thinking about the environment. So many our problems are a combination of, our individual psyches, our biology, and our environments, right? And if we're stuck in just thinking as an isolated individual, it's usually pretty fucking hard. It's not impossible. Some people can do it. You get heroic individuals who can do it, and all credit to them, right? I've got nothing but praise for them. But actually, at the moment, we've got systems, for example, with addiction, I would argue with depression and attention as well, and with weight, actually, where the system is rigged against you, right? It's like you're having to run up and down escalator to get to be healthy, right? Some people can do it. Some people run up and down escalator. I fucking can't. But
the rare few.
Yeah, there's a few. But what I want to do is let's get the escalator carrying you in the right direction. Let's make it easy for you to make the positive changes in your life, not to make it hard, right?
Because a lot of people want to do that, Johann, right? A lot of people do that. They realise the errors of their ways. They get so down in, but there's just not the support element of being able to, for someone offering their hand. It's like, no, it's too late now. You're a druggie. You're an addict. You're a criminal. You're tarnished with so many black brushes because ultimately, let's be honest, they've made a mistake. They've fucked up in life. We all do it. We failed in life up to now. So you, me, all of us in this room have, and we're going to fail to the day we die. We're going to make mistakes, right? But it's just that stigma of addiction, of being a crackhead, of being a junkie, of being a fucking criminal. It's like that. That's almost like not the impossible task, but it sounds like it is.
Well, I think you've put it brilliantly, and I think it's partly about undoing stigma, but it's also about knowing where your power lies, right? So we talk a lot when we're trying to help people, and this is not just true of addiction, it's true of people who've got all sorts of problems. We talk absolutely rightly about what you can do as an isolated individual to change your life. You can change your mindset. Also, and I'm passionately in favour of that. A lot of my book about attention is about how we can get our attention back through doing these individual things as well. But I also would want to add a prong to it, which doesn't take away anything from the individual responsibility. In fact, I think it adds to it, which is there's another source of your power, which is you can change yourself better when you change with other people and you change with the cage.
When I sat down with you, I thought you had let's call it a healthy obsession with the topic addiction. But it seems like that you've got an obsession with helping people. Everything that I try and put back on you, you put back on other people. And I'm just like, wow, you have got an innate just obsession or passion to want to help people. Where did that come from?
I mean, everyone listening has people who help them because you didn't raise yourself as a baby, right? You didn't. So if I think about my grandmother...
But who helped you?
Think about my grandmother, for example. So my grandmother, my Scottish grandmother, was who brought me up, basically, me and my sister, and to some degree my brother, who's a bit older. My grandmother was an amazing person. My grandmother left school when she was 13. She went to work in a laundry. Her husband died when he was very young. She had a very... so she raised her kids on her own. Her job was to clean toilets. She did every job she could do. I think about my grandmother... she was just an amazing person, incredibly loving person. And, she'd had this fucking hard life. And then when I'm a kid, she must have had she wanted to relax, right? And then she suddenly got these, this kind of looking after these kids. I think my grandmother was a great example. I had so many teachers who were really good to me. I had just so many people in my life have been really, really good to me. I've had people be mean to me as well, obviously, But
where's that compassion to want to help others, which is evident for me, that sits at the forefront of everything that you do? Almost that is at the forefront, and everything trickles down. Your topics of addiction, your topics of wanting to really, your journalism, that sort of filters down where a lot of people put journalism at the top. You're maybe interested. For me, I see your compassion to want to help people, because ultimately that's where your journalism fits in. You're not going out fucking trying to, bring down criminals. You're trying to say, why are these people like this? Why do people get addicted? What can we do to better people? The human side of it is so fucking present and obvious. But something must have happened.
I think we all have
that compassion comes from.
I think everyone we all exist, and we all seesaw around a spectrum between concern for other people and narcissistic concern for the self, right? And of course, you should be concerned for yourself to some degree as well. It's important. It's not, we don't want people to be totally self-sacrificing. And the truth is, so we live in this culture which is constantly pushing people to be self-obsessed, think about yourself, to be narcissistic, think about how you feel after half an hour looking at Instagram, right? Like so we live in this culture that is constantly pushing us towards the ego and self-obsession. And I'm probably more vulnerable to that than most people. And the truth is, that will make you feel like shit. Whereas moments of openness and love towards other people will make you feel better. So in some sense, there's a kind of selfish impulse behind my desire to be compassionate, because I think about this a lot in relation to this guy I interviewed a lot, amazing man, you should have him on your podcast, called Professor Tim Kasser. So the way I think about his work is, everyone knows junk food has taken over our diets and made us physically sick, right? But actually, a kind of junk values have taken over our minds and made us mentally sick, right? And Professor Kasser was the first person to really research this. So for thousands of years, philosophers have said, if you think life is about money and status and showing off, you're going to feel like shit, right? It's not an exact quote from Confucius, but that's basically what he said, right? Mm-hmm. But weirdly, no one had actually scientifically investigated it until Professor Kasser did all this amazing psychological research over 40 years. And basically he proved, to give you the headline, the philosophers were right. The more you think life is about money and status and showing off and ego, the worse you will feel, right? And the way I began to think of it is almost like, just like junk food has taken over our diets, a kind of junk values have taken over our minds, right? We're trained to look for happiness in all the wrong places. It's like we're fed a kind of KFC for the soul, right?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
We're if you think about, there's a really interesting bit of research. It was done by lots of scientists, but one of them was Dr. Brett Ford, who I interviewed about it. Really simple research. They looked at 4 countries. It was the United States, Japan, Taiwan, and Russia. And they wanted to figure out, let's imagine you deliberately wanted to make yourself happier, right? So you said, right, from now on, I'm going to spend 2 hours a day deliberately making myself happier. Would you actually become happier, right? I write about this in my book, Lost Connections. And what they found at first seems really weird. In the United States, if you try to make yourself happier, in the main, you do not become happier. But in Russia, Taiwan, and Japan, if you try to make yourself happier, it works. You do become happier. And they're like, well, that's weird. What's going on? So I did more research on it. What I discovered was, in the US, I'm sure this is true of us in Britain and Australia as well, if you try to make yourself happier, you do something for you. You work harder to get a promotion. You buy a load of shit you don't need to display it on Instagram to make people go, OMG, so jealous. You do you, right? You treat yourself. So we have, the fancy way of putting it would be, we have an individualistic conception of happiness. You think your happiness stems from your ego and you doing well, you as an isolated individual. In the other places, when you try to make yourself happier, you did something for someone else, your friends, your family, your community, right? So they have an instinctively kind of collective idea of happiness, right? That happiness comes from being part of a group, that rises with you or falls with you, right? And we've moved way too far. I'm in favour of some level of individualism. Individualism is a good thing to some degree. I don't want to go back to the village my dad lived in where there was no room for individual expression. But we've gone so far towards that, and it trains us to look for happiness in all the wrong places. You are not going to lie on your day.
Quick fix, right?
Totally.
Mm-hmm.
Well, or even a slow fix in the wrong direction. Like, you're not going to lie on your deathbed, Anne, and think about all the likes you got on Instagram and all the shoes you bought, right? You're going to think about moments of love and meaning and connection in your life. But the way Professor Kasser put it to me is we live in a machine that is designed to get us to neglect what is important about life, right? We live in a machine that is constantly pushing us towards... these individualistic, narcissistic forms of expression.
It's almost like synthetic highs, isn't it? It's like you're getting these synthetic highs because they're boosting you in the moment and you feel good about yourself. Ultimately, like I said, strip all that away. It's just been fought. But I think society has a huge part to play on that because, these big companies, and we can get into the politics of, big pharma, big companies, et cetera, but they're ultimately what's feeding these addictions in order to keep us in that state of mind.
Totally. So there's a lot for all of the things we're talking about, whether it's addiction, whether it's attention problems, all the stuff I write my books about. There's sort of two levels at which I think we've got to defend, we've got to respond to this, right? I think of them as defense and offense. Yeah. There are loads of things we can do at an individual level to defend ourselves, right? But also we've got to go on offense against the forces that are doing this to us, right? You mentioned some of the companies like big tech, we've got to regulate those fuckers, right? There's all sorts of things that we can do. Like, think about the fact that more 3-year-old children know what the McDonald's M means than know their own last name, right? Now, you didn't put that in your head when you were 3 years old. I didn't put that in my head. That's a machine doing that to us. Well, some countries have banned advertising junk food to children. It's fucking bad for them.
Brainwashing, basically.
Don't fucking poison your kids' brains to then want to poison their bodies, right? There's all sorts of things we can do that regulate the environment. Now, you can't do that on your own. There's lots of things you can do individually on your own, and we should do both. And the individual stuff makes you stronger to fight for the collective stuff, and the collective stuff makes you more likely to succeed at the individual stuff. So it's actually a very happy kind of tango once you get into it.
How do you do it? Because you can't do it, especially now when we thought we had this free voice of social media platforms that are now, we talk about big tech, that are so controlled nowadays. If you actually speak out the truth, you're restricted, or you're shadow banned, or you're ghost banned, whatever it may be. So, but it's like we're fighting an almost impossible task, because you mentioned big tech, big pharma, they rule the world.
I understand why it feels that way, but I would just tell you two stories I think that answer that. So whenever I feel hopeless, and there are days when I feel that way, because it's natural, I think a lot about a really close friend of mine called Andrew Sullivan. He's a British-American writer. So in 1994, Andrew was diagnosed as HIV positive. It's the height of the AIDS crisis. His best friend Patrick had just died. As far as anyone knew, there was no hope in sight. He's like, fuck, whatever he was in his 30s, I've got a couple of years to live. Fuck. And he decided to do a completely crazy thing. He quit his job and he went to a little place called Provincetown, and he decided he was going to write a book about a crazy utopian idea that no one had ever written a book about before, right? And he was like, okay, no one alive today is ever going to see this put into practice. I'm clearly not going to live to see it put into practice. Maybe somewhere down the line, someone's going to find this fucking crazy book, right? The idea he wrote, the first ever book advocating for, was gay marriage, right? So you've got to picture how crazy it was. You've got 2,000 years of gay people being fucking burned, imprisoned, hated, every religious text in the world, every country in the world. And he's like, no, let's let gay people get married, right? And this is the height of gay people being hated. There's this paranoia about AIDS and fear about AIDS. And so he writes this book. And when I get pessimistic, I try to imagine, right, okay, I try to imagine going back in time to 1994 when Andrew's writing Virtually Normal and going, okay, Andrew, you're not going to believe me, but 26 years from now, A, you'll be alive. That would have fucking blown his mind. B, you'll be married to a man because that will be legal. C, I'll be with you when the Supreme Court of the United States quotes this book you're writing, when it makes it mandatory for every state in the United States to introduce gay marriage. And the next day, you'll be invited to have dinner with the president in a White House lit up in the colours of the rainbow flag to celebrate what you and millions of other people have achieved. Oh, and by the way, that president, he's going to be black, right? That would have sounded like the most fucking crazy science fiction, right? Be like, me going, right, so 26 years from now, and you and me, a trans prime minister is going to invite us to smoke crack in Downing Street with her, right? It would have sounded, not that we want that. I mean, the trans prime minister, yes, not the crack.
Let's do it, let's be the first.
But you see what I mean, right? 2,000 years, fucking horrific homophobia.
Yeah.
it falls in
does,
a generation or two, right?
There is hope.
And you think about that in relation to tech. I'll give you another story, right? You don't go, oh, tech is so powerful, and of course it's enormously powerful. But I'll give you an example of someone I would never normally praise. Let's do the spirit of Philip Owen, and I'll praise someone that I fucking hate 99% of the time. Scott Morrison, right? So Scott Morrison did something really good. So as a lot of people will know, the media is being bankrupted by these social media platforms because, 25 years ago you would put an advert in the Sydney Morning Herald and now you put an advert on Facebook. So people get their news from Facebook, but the advertising money goes to Facebook, not to the Sydney Morning Herald, right? So they're losing their print readers and they're losing all their advertising revenue. And this is happening all over the world, and it's very bad for democracy if you don't have media, right? So Scott Morrison, not a man I'd ever normally praise, entirely to his credit, said to Facebook, you're going to have to give some of your advertising revenue to the Australian media. People go to your website for the news.
Yeah, I heard about this.
You've got to fund this. And you remember at the time...
That's a big deal, actually.
Facebook shit the bed. They cut
did,
Australia off from key functions. They threatened to cut them off completely, right? Mm-hmm. And what happened? Quietly, they gave in, right? Now some of that money goes to the Australian media. We are so much stronger than they are. They are really fucking unpopular. Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, we are much stronger than they are. They want to project this image that they're, there's good things and bad things about them, of course.
No, I agree. I know exactly where you're coming from.
If you think about the history of collective struggle, if you think about the power we can claim together against these forces that are fucking us up. My book, Stolen Focus, is about how these forces are fucking up our attention, and actually lots of other forces are fucking up our attention as well, and how we can reclaim our minds. But we don't have to accept being fucked over when it comes to addiction, when it comes to depression, when it comes to attention, when it comes to the obesity crisis. We don't have to accept this, right? It's not a force of nature. It's not inevitable to living in a modern society. It is a result of very particular, powerful forces that we can take on and change. But it requires a shift in mindset, right? You obviously talk a lot about mindset quite rightly. We need to realise we are not medieval peasants begging fucking Mark Zuckerberg and King Musk for a few little crumbs of attention from their table. We are free people. We are the free citizens of democracies. We own our own minds. Yeah. We can take our minds back from these forces if we want to, but we've got to understand what's being done to them. Mm-hmm. We've got to understand it in a wider context. We've got to understand the cage we've been put in. Yeah. And together we can dismantle that cage, right?
Mm-hmm. Love that. Do you know what? I'm going to finish on that because that was super powerful. Oh. Absolutely love this conversation, mate. There's so much more to you than meets the eye. And I think, talk about humanity, that's all we can do, right, is be there for each other, lift each other up. And if we can be there to show a bit of love, a bit of guidance and to push people on in the right direction, then, the world is a powerful place that we can control, right?
Exactly. We, not me.
Yeah, and we, not me. I love that. Thank you, mate. Thank you so much for joining me on Headgame. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss any of our incredible stories, and leave me a review wherever you're listening. I'm Matt Middleton. Catch you again next time.